Okay, so one way the governor is trying to get at this issue of getting more people out in an effective, cost-effective, and efficient way with degrees is through some innovation. And he's put together this pot of $50 million for innovation awards. We'll hear about that from the Department of Finance, and then we'll hear comments from the LAO and the segments. Finance.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, the budget includes $50 million for innovation awards to recognize and reward UC, CSU, and community college campuses or groups of these campuses that take ambitious actions to more effectively use their existing resources and to improve the productivity of the state's higher education system as a whole. Last year, as you're all well aware, the state enacted a set of goals for higher education as a system. In short, these are first, to improve student access and success, second, to better align degrees and credentials with the state's economic, workforce, and civic needs, and third, to ensure effective and efficient use of resources to increase outcomes and maintain affordability. Progress towards these goals will require action on the part of the state, the segments, and campuses. This proposal creates priorities for campuses that are consistent with and support progress toward the state's overarching goals, namely to increase the number of degrees awarded, to reduce the time it takes students to complete those degrees, and to ease transfer for students who attend the community colleges and for those who bring knowledge and skills from other experiences. Funding would be awarded next spring to the campuses that implement new instructional models that best align with the state's priorities, have the broadest impacts, and are sustainable over time. Awards will be made by a committee chaired by the Director of Finance. Its members will include governing board members from each of the state's public education segments and appointees of the Senate Rules Committee and the Assembly Speaker. There are 2 points that we believe are central to this approach. First, because the budget separately funds K-12 schools, community colleges, the UC, and the CSU, the state's education segments do not necessarily have a fiscal incentive to integrate their efforts to ensure efficient use of the state's resources. For example, lower division college courses are offered in each of the segments, including in K-12 through advanced placement and international baccalaureate courses and other means. However, when a student transfers between systems or to one of the universities, that student may be required to take a nearly identical course, depending on the program requirements at a particular campus. The administration's proposal creates an incentive for the systems to better align their efforts and reduce duplication. Second, these awards are being made to campuses because within each of the segments, many of the decisions that impact sustainability and performance are made locally rather than by the system-wide offices. The proposal encourages campus leaders to evaluate the impacts of existing policies and practices and to change those that remain in place primarily due to institutional inertia without improving student outcomes. We also note that because applications for these awards will describe actions taken by the campuses that have improved productivity, they can be used to evaluate the actions the UC and the CSU will describe in their sustainability plans as necessary to balance their budgets moving forward. This proposal builds on the actions taken by the governor and the legislature last year and seeks to change institutional behavior to advance the state's goals. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on now to the LAO to comment on this innovation grant.
Good morning. Judy Hyman, Legislative Analyst's Office. Just a couple things I'd like to clarify before going into our assessment of this. One is that, as Finance described, these are rewards. They're not the typical grant where an applicant would propose what they plan to do with funds and then be awarded funds based on that proposal. They're a reward for actions already taken. After the awardees are selected, they will then submit information about how they plan to spend the money, but that's not part of the decision-making process, if I understand correctly.
Sure. Correct.
So that's a nuance. Our main concern about this proposal is that it really sends the wrong message by earmarking a relatively small amount of one-time funding for institutions that prioritize meeting the state's overall needs and goals. The governor seems to somehow be suggesting that that's different from what the segment should be doing with the rest of their state funding. Presumably, the state expects that they would use all of their core funding to address state priorities. So that's our main concern. Second, we believe that this fragments improvement efforts that are already underway. Last year, you approved Senate Bill 195, which sets out 3 broad state goals for higher education and expects that the segment's progress on those goals will be used as part of the legislative budget process in allocating funds. This proposal seems to sidestep that approach by empowering a small group of individuals to allocate new funding based on the governor's stated priorities. And then a third concern is the timing of the proposal. The administration indicates that this is meant to build on some efforts last year with the technology initiative and, as well as some other ongoing efforts to improve productivity and reduce costs. Those efforts haven't had time to come to fruition. The segments haven't reported back on how those are going, so it seems premature to now be going in a different direction with a new initiative that has ultimately the same goals. So for these reasons, we recommend that you reject this proposal.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move to the segments. Why don't we have the community colleges go first?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Chair Block and members of the Education Budget Subcommittee. I'm Michael McGee with the California Community College Chancellor's Office. Regarding the budget proposal for the innovative models of higher education, what we're prepared to talk about is if the funding goes through, we will be prepared to work collaboratively with UC and CSU on projects to improve our efforts in student success, transfer, online education, and other innovation. In fact, our heads of systems are already working together as best they can in meeting some of these goals and beginning those efforts.
Thank you. Move to CSU.
Not much different than what was just said by Mr. McGee. I think the one thing that I would add on to that is the fact that this being one-time money in nature, it'd be really hard to invest that money in anything kind of people-powered, so to speak. We would have to be one-time activities. So it would be quite difficult to invest in a way that would be perhaps the most efficient and the best use of those funds. So we'll definitely come up with a proposal, I think, from all of our segments where we could optimize that, but it kind of does box us in by those monies being one-time in nature versus kind of an ongoing in nature. That's just a minor point, I think. But
Okay, you see?
So I see a lot of potential with this idea. I too would agree actually with the LAO on some of the concerns and with CSU noting it's one-time monies. But I think if I get a little bit beyond your imagination and how you crafted this, just pull me back in. I actually think the intent is there because one of the challenges, Mr. Chairman and members, sometimes is very specific areas at the local level where we need a more concerted effort to make improvements. So as you are well aware, we have some community colleges, for instance, that do quite well in transfer to UC and CSU, and others that have greater challenges, either because of the student population that they serve or the relationship that they might have with a UC or a CSU campus. So I see this kind of regional process to have a lot of merit and a lot of potential. The president has her own community college transfer initiative. She's been having extensive discussions with Chancellor Harris and Chancellor White, and it is looking at this very issue. How can we provide incentives and do collaborative efforts at the local level, not just between the campuses, but expanding that when you need resources for trying to achieve a coordinated effort with the business community to ensure that we're meeting workforce needs, and philanthropy to see what other investments that might occur at that local level that might complement what they're proposing here. So I see a lot of potential here, but I would concur that I think that we have to talk a little bit more about how this actually might play out.
Yeah, understanding the constraints of one-time money, what kinds of projects have been discussed either within the segments or across segments?
Certainly, some of the beginning projects have been with respect to online education and also enhancing student success. SB 1440 degrees, as was mentioned before, we're making great progress on that and would like to engage more, I think, with UC. We have a strong engagement with CSU that's improving by leaps and bounds, and there's a number of areas like that, and including with respect to our veterans coming through and getting college credit for academic instruction. There are ideas like that that we are starting at the local level. A lot of work is being done creatively at the local level that could be enhanced. At least if that's the opportunity, we would pursue it.
Okay. I see DOF wants to speak.
Hi, Molly Quasabarth from Department of Finance. As far as the one-time funding goes, I just kind of wanted to extrapolate on that was a conscious decision to make it one-time funding because these funds aren't intended to pay for new programs and to recover the costs. It is simply an award for campuses to get together and really try to come up with something new. And the kind of the programs that we're thinking of would not require a lot of ongoing funding. We're not looking for, sure, a great way to increase graduation rates would be to hire a lot more faculty. We're not looking for, big increases in positions or whatnot, but they're things more like accepting credits, outside the classroom or online. So that intent is it's a one-time nature.
Thank you for that. Senator Liu, any questions or comments?
No, I don't have any questions about this. We'll leave this open, aren't we?
Okay, yes, this is another item that we're going to leave open pending the May revise. So I want to thank this panel and excuse this panel. And we'll move now to the CSU capital outlay process. This will be an item on which we'll be voting. And again, there will be public comment after discussion of this before the vote. We'll ask the CSU to remain. Of course, community colleges and UC are excused. And we will first hear from the Department of Finance regarding this proposal.
Thank you. As we heard earlier, the CSU has identified significant infrastructure challenges, including those related to capital renewal and deferred maintenance. The governor's budget creates a mechanism for the CSU to address those needs, while at the same time creating a stronger incentive for the university to consider the total cost of its operations when deciding how best to use state resources to meet the goals for higher education enacted last year. This approach is consistent with efforts across the state's budget to give an entity responsible for a program flexibility to use its expertise to determine the best way to implement that program, as well as responsibility for supporting all of the associated costs. In general, the university's costs include both day-to-day operations and the infrastructure that supports those operations. The budget makes 4 separate changes that are each related to this new perspective. First, the budget combines existing general fund appropriations for operations and infrastructure. To create this single appropriation, the university's general fund support appropriation is increased by $297 million in 14-15 to fully support the costs of debt service on bonds issued by the state for university projects. Second, the budget also increases this appropriation by $142 million in 14-15 pursuant to the administration's multi-year funding plan. Moving forward, the administration's intent is that the appropriation would grow pursuant to the multi-year funding plan, which proposes augmentations of $120 million in 15-16 and $124 million in 16-17. The administration's multi-year funding plan provides the CSU with an increase equivalent to what the UC receives in a given year. In 14-15, as we have discussed, the UC receives a 5% increase on all of its general fund resources, including those resources the UC is now using to pay the cost of debt service on state bonds. If the state were to fund the CSU's debt service costs separately from its operating costs, the administration would instead provide the CSU with an augmentation of $132 million in 14-15, based on a 5% increase in the UC's general fund resources, excluding those resources required to support state debt service. In addition to the increase in the CSU's appropriation pursuant to the multi-year plan, the administration would also increase this appropriation to fund new lease revenue rental payments for projects authorized by the state prior to the Budget Act of 2013. Third, the budget authorizes the CSU to use its general fund appropriation for infrastructure costs. Legislation accompanying the Budget Act would provide the university with new authority to use those resources to issue debt to restructure lease revenue bonds issued by the state for university projects, which could reduce costs for the university and allow it to redirect funds for other priorities, issue debt for new capital outlay or deferred maintenance, or fund capital outlay on a pay-as-you-go basis. The state provided this authority to the UC beginning in 1314. The UC is required to seek authorization from the state before using general fund resources for these costs. The CSU would be required to seek that same authorization. Fourth, the budget gives the university greater authority in implementing its infrastructure projects, which could also reduce its costs. Specifically, trailer bill legislation would authorize the state fire marshal to delegate enforcement of building standards to university employees, consistent with the fire marshal's existing authority to delegate to UC employees. It would also authorize the university to use one contract to perform multiple projects at multiple campuses. And finally, it would authorize the university to provide public notice of bids for contracts online, consistent with the authority already provided to some other state agencies. The components of this proposal align with the request approved by the CSU trustees and submitted to the governor in the fall. We believe this approach encourages efficiency and ensures that the university considers all parts of its operations when considering how to make progress towards the state goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's hear from the LAO now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have a number of concerns with this proposal. First, we don't think the Department of Finance has really provided a strong rationale for changing how capital outlay projects are handled at the CSU. They indicate that the proposal would provide more flexibility to the system and allow it to make trade-offs between capital and operating needs, which traditionally has been your role. I would imagine from the CSU's perspective, the problem this is meant to solve is that they haven't had state-funded capital outlay for a number of years, but that is because the governor has not proposed, as part of his overall budget package, capital projects for the CSU. Rather than providing additional funding for the CSU to issue its own bonds to fund capital outlay projects, that could just as well happen on the state side through lease revenue bonds. But our greatest concern overall is that this diminishes the legislature's role in very important decisions, not just for the universities, but statewide decisions about how you want to allocate and prioritize infrastructure spending across the state. In the past, you've been able to weigh the needs of higher education against the needs of other areas of state government, and this would kind of take higher education out of that mix. The third concern is that the amount of funding that would be shifted into CSU's operating budget for capital needs under this proposal is not linked to any real assessment of what the ongoing need is. It's a point-in-time amount. It's how much we happen to be spending now on debt service for both general obligation and state lease revenue bonds. We already know that in some years coming up very soon, that would leave the CSU short by about $40 million for debt service on projects that already have been approved, that are already in the works. And then in years after that, CSU would have significant headroom as bonds get paid off. So there's been no analysis of the long-term needs and what the right amount of funding would be. It's a bit arbitrary. Also, CSU initially indicated in its trustees' budget proposal that it would plan to use this new authority and the funding that it was receiving as part of the governor's proposal, and as well as its additional requests, to begin addressing a serious problem with deferred maintenance, an accumulated $1.8 billion in deferred maintenance at the university. But upon further analysis, my understanding is that the Chancellor's office has said that it could be several years, perhaps 8 years, before they could begin really addressing that problem. So this proposal doesn't really do anything in the short term to address some very pressing needs. So given the lack of a compelling policy rationale, some serious concerns about taking this out of the regular state budget process and how that diminishes your role and also diminishes transparency, and that it doesn't help to address pressing needs, we recommend that you reject this proposal.
Okay, thank you. Now let's hear from the CSU.
Ryan Storm with CSU again. I'm joined by my colleague, Vi San Juan. She is Assistant Vice Chancellor for Capital Planning. We've provided you a brief presentation, and we can walk through it real quickly, but the second page should look like this. You might have two that look very similar. First and foremost, before we get going on this, I wanted to really say that we've seen this proposal 3 times now in front of the CSU, and we anticipated that we would see a similar proposal again this year out of the administration. And we worked very, very hard to work with the administration to craft a proposal statutorily that would really facilitate the ability for us to deal with all of our pressing capital needs, our deferred maintenance, needed renovations of our existing facilities, and potentially new ones. So this presentation is not an intention to throw finance under the bus in any way, shape, or form. They've been more than willing and very gracious in helping us craft this statute, to the point where we believe that statutorily we would be equipped to be able to handle a lot of our capital projects if it were approved. That being said, though, I think we need to talk about a little bit more about walking you through our condition, where we are on things, and then let you know kind of where we stand in terms of this proposal now. Since we worked with finance, I wanted to also mention that we have had a lot of conversations with our leadership, our trustees, and there have been a number of concerns raised. So I think we went to finance in good faith to work with them, but the leaders of our organization have voiced some pretty significant concerns. So Vi, if you wanted to segue to the next slide that we have.
Thank you. Good morning. And again, Vi Sanwan, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Cal State University. So the first slide really summarizes the typical funding for state capital outlay, being general obligation bonds approved by the voters, state public works board bonds approved by the legislature, and that statutorily we have very limited authority to use general fund dollars for improvements, limited based on size of the dollar value of those projects for improvements. The next slide, which shows historical funding for capital outlay from 2001 to 2013-14, shows the heavy reliance we've had on general obligation bonds in the past. And this is just the CSU share. So, of course, in that mix there was community colleges and University of California. And the California State University over time has gotten less of a share of the GO bonds as community colleges has increased. And University of California has had special needs that have given them a kick over CSU as well. So this shows that the legislature has approved the use of the red bars, which is lease revenue bonds, in times of economic stimulus. That was 2002, and then starting again in 2008. And one of the keys with the lease revenue bonds is based on their financial structure. We cannot use those funds for partial renovations. So that would be mainly renewal of capital systems, building systems, HVAC, electrical, that have reached their useful life, and end of their useful life. So really, GO bonds is our primary source to address capital renewal, also called deferred maintenance if it's the end of its useful life, seismic strengthening, ADA projects. So we've lost a lot of capability in moving to lease revenue bonds. On the next slide, it shows that same historical capital outlay funding on the first part of the graph off to the left from 2001 again to 13-14. And in 2014-15, what was in front of you, your first action today, is consideration of $6 million in equipment. So if you think of that $6 million being approved potentially for 14-15, because thank you for your 2 votes so far, compared to a $500 million need from our campuses, and across all the black bars is our 5-year plan that we present to the trustees and to the legislature as one of our requirements statutorily, is what our campuses are looking for renovations and growth to meet enrollment. And those bars add up to about $7 billion. So one of LAO's comments is, what's the assessment of need? This shows you where we were historically as far as funding. We got to about an average of maybe $350 million a year from GO bonds, and some lesser amount. You can see the significant decline in recent years of capital funding compared to the need of the $7 billion. And the trustees approve categories and criteria on an annual basis that sets priorities for the CSU. They align fairly well with the state and the legislative analysts as far as fire life safety, critical needs for infrastructure, and then growth being the second priority. So on the whole, on our our capital funding, we have tended to spend about 70% of our funding on existing infrastructure. So that gives you a feel for, the limited dollars that have gone for growth, but certainly at Monterey Bay, Channel Islands, San Marcos, our newer campuses, that's where the key growth has been. And then we've had a lot of demand at other campuses, our San Diego campuses as well, up across the system. So the next slide is really trying to walk you into, do you have the bullet points that Ryan will go over?